where's the list of folks who passed the laws in the first place that made the taxes so high? Where's the list of folks who passed the laws on how to handle COVID so poorly? Where's the list of folks who passed laws that made it unsafe to go into New York City? But let's talk about this whole idea of donor states versus recipient states, which I know Tom talked about yesterday. Keep in mind one thing. States don't pay taxes. People pay taxes. The reason that on average New Yorkers pay more than they do in my state in South Carolina is that they make more. That's the system that Tom likes. That's the system that Tom wants to encourage, that rich people should pay more. In fact, he had a bill, I know it passed out of the House last year that got rid of the SALT, reinstated the SALT deduction for 2 years, but raised the income tax rate forever. So, I mean, I hear the rhetoric, and I know it's hard for New York politicians to want to blame themselves. They want to blame somebody else for the difficulties that New York is having. But to blame the federal government and the SALT changes that we put in 2017 for the challenges that state is facing is simply, it's not accurate. And that's why I wanted to have a chat with Tom today on your show.
So let me make it clear that New York State, let me make it clear that New York State's doing a great job compared to a lot of places in this country dealing with the coronavirus. A lot of people died early on. It was a new phenomenon in the United States, and we really faced some real tragedy in our state. And that's why we need a COVID relief package for the entire country right now, including state and local aid for places that have been decimated by loss of revenues. The reality is that the state of New York needs to be more competitive. There's no question about that. But the elimination of the SALT deduction has been a real punch in the gut. And yes, I did propose that we raise the top income tax rate for the wealthiest Americans who make over $400,000 a year back to what it was before President Trump and you came into office. It was 39.6. For some inexplicable reason, you lowered the rate of taxes on the wealthiest people in the United States of America from 39.6 to 37. So I think that we need to have the SALT deduction reinstated, and we should also raise the income tax rate for the highest earners in America back to 39.6.
One of the reasons that we got rid of SALT, and it was a philosophical issue, was that it's a subsidy, it's an incentive for state and local governments to raise taxes. When we want people to save money for retirement, we allow them to take a deduction for their contributions to the IRA. When we want them to pay more for their own health care, we give them a tax deduction for contributions to the health savings account. The state and local tax deduction was simply an incentive to pay more taxes. When you subsidize something, you get more of it. And many of states, such as yours, your county, took advantage of that to raise taxes and were able to go to the taxpayers and say, well, don't worry, because you're not going to pay all of this because you get to get a deduction on your federal tax return. That's not fair to the lower tax states. What we tried to do was level the playing field with a flat deduction that would be the same from state to state, so that there was some accountability to local and state leaders who were raising taxes.
Mick, we have a very astute viewer who wrote something, and I want to ask you about it. If a U.S. citizen pays income tax today to a foreign state, to a foreign country, they get an uncapped foreign tax credit. This is not, by the way, merely a deduction against their U.S. tax liability, their federal tax bill. However, if they pay income tax to a domestic state, right, like New York, they get capped. Does that make any sense to you in the world?
Andrew, in fairness, I'm not familiar with the first one. I know there were some tax incentives to encourage Americans to go overseas to work, because when Americans work overseas, they tend to want to do business with American companies, so it helps our exports. But I'm not familiar with the details of that specific tax credit that you're talking about. But come back to your point about go ahead.
Andrew, I am familiar with this tax credit, and it's the same thing that right now businesses can deduct their taxes that they pay to state and local governments, but they made it so that individuals couldn't deduct their full deduction. It's simply unfair. It's unfair that people are being taxed on taxes they pay. That doesn't make sense. It's not fair that this deduction has been in place since 1913. It was the first deduction put in place when the Progressive Income Tax Code was put in place. It was the very first. Why? Because we wanted to protect states' rights. We wanted to be able to protect states' ability to do what they want. And the people who will hold them accountable are the people who live in those states. And they will hold them accountable. I campaigned on getting a property tax cap in my state because I thought the property taxes were increasing too much, especially for the schools. So we'll hold our own people accountable in our state.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.